The Transvestites by Magnus Hirschfeld. Case 13. I was born, writes, in 1862. My father was a Tyrolean gamekeeper for the empire for 10 or more years. My father and my mother were both born in Vorarlberg, as we were too. Father died in 1867 of consumption. He was supposed to have drunk a lot. Mother died 1.5 years later. She was supposed to have been infected by my sick father. I am supposed to be the spitting image of my mother. I later found out that I was still wearing girls' clothing when the brother 2 years younger than I was wearing pants. Mother told me I did not want any trousers and put up such a fuss that I got to keep the dresses, and since my sister was 1 year older, I could wear her clothes until Mother died in 1867. My aunts then forced me to wear boys' clothing. My sisters went to live with an aunt who lived several kilometers from us. Before I was born, Mother was supposed to have wanted a girl. Grandfather would have allowed me to wear girls' clothing if my aunts had not been so against it. The doctor was supposed to have said I would be a fine young boy, but I clearly remember I always only wanted to be a girl, and my relatives and acquaintances would tease me with words such as little girl, girl's face, or Joanna. Also, many people were supposed to have asked why then the little girl wore boys' clothing. I always liked Shrovetide because on that day it was allowed to run around in girls' clothing. I was always envious when I saw my aunt put on her clothes because I was not allowed to put on girls' clothing too. Because aunt and uncle were much more pious than my grandfather and father, I was soon brought to a Catholic orphanage of the Sisters of Mercy. Soon after, I became the favorite of Mother Superior Joachima. I often sat on her lap. She kissed me a lot, and I was allowed to do what the other children might not. Also, I was chosen to run all the errands to clergymen in the area. Even at night, I would be awakened to bring the priest to someone who was dying. The Mother Superior said that I, Hansel, performed best without asking questions. Likewise, I kept everything to myself or forgot everything afterward. Later, when I was already in America, my sister would often include in her letters regards from Mother Superior. She remembers to this day that I had been such an intelligent child and useful to everyone. I, too, have often thought about the Mother Superior more than anyone else, and often thought that she had been a good mother. However, she would not allow me girls' clothing. On the contrary, she always dissuaded me from having these thoughts and tried to get me to go to Brixton in the Tyrol and into the Pontifical Boys' Seminary, but I wanted to go to Bregenz, to the Teachers' Seminary, because later I thought, when I finished at the Teachers' Seminary, I could go around as a governess or as a children's teacher. Even at that time, I had firm plans to come forward as a woman. But when I realized that my guardian would not give me my father's inheritance unless I went to Brixton, I began to think of ways I could thwart this. The Mother Superior always told me how nice I would have it as a priest, how my parents would be released from purgatory as soon as I said my first Mass, and much more. But at the time, I was already praying only because the director wished me to do so. Also, the Mother Superior often took me with her when she went into other regions to visit the sisters who lived there. I was always with her among the Sisters of Mercy, who treated me well and introduced me to the other children as a good example. As a rule, it was customary for the best girl to come along, but the Mother Director preferred me. Once she even took me into the home for mothers near Feldkirch, and I heard as the resident director, who was her superior, asked her why she had a boy as a companion. She replied, "Reverend Mother, Hansel is the most polite, most honest, and most silent child in my charge, and in many respects takes the place of many girls." Well, when I saw that they were not going to allow me to study to be a teacher, I still had the thought again and again, in spite of all my religious training, of secretly procuring and setting aside some girls' clothing and running away in them. Then, when I became employed as a general hand for a rich landowner who owned a lot of property, cows, and pasture in the Alps, at the first opportunity I stole from a girl who was my size. I put on her things and took certificate of domicile and burned my boy's things that night. Everything boyish I left behind in Vorarlberg and went to Switzerland so that my relatives would not know where I was. I was anxious about writing and was afraid, too, that they could force me to go as a boy. Well, I first went to work as a nanny and did general housework. At the same time, I learned embroidery. I did not like the first mistress, but I later got another one and even more pay. However, she unfortunately found out that I was not a real girl, but she did not make a big fuss about it because she said she had never had such a good woman worker. Meanwhile, I grew strong and not ugly, so that boys would lie in wait for me. My mistress gave me much good advice. I followed it and went dancing in the evening in the company of boys. At that time, I felt fully a young woman, except when the fellows got fresh with me, and it would occur to me that, unfortunately, I was not one. I mostly enjoyed Sundays, when I could go walking with the children, and me in a starched slip, white pinafore, and little hat. That was when I felt I was in heaven. Only when a handsome man looked at me in a friendly way was I annoyed that I did not have better breasts and hips. Sometimes, when I saw a young woman bathing, I wished I had the shape of her body, and gladly would have given her mine. Since I was still religious, I prayed, "Dear God, please make me into a girl." At 16 and a half, a man tried to rape me. I protected myself, but he gave me a bad name as being a hermaphrodite, so I had to move away and went to France, where I started as an embroiderer in Luneville. I had a friendship with a girl who, like me, was in opposition to her sex, namely manly, and when she went to St. Quentin to the embroidery factory there, I followed her. Not long after, an embroiderer coaxed me to come to Paris where I could earn more. There I had the opportunity for the first time to come together with women who with other women lived like married people, which in France is a rather widespread custom. Well, since I was a good woman worker with satin, embroiderers tried to get my employer to loan me out for a time because their women embroiderers were not as skillful as I. So, one time it happened that I was forced to sleep together with a young woman my own age. I always had the custom of putting my shirt between my legs in such a way that no one could see my organ. In the middle of the night, however, my bedmate woke me up and said to me that I was not made right. At first I was embarrassed and asked how she could say that. She said, "I always touch the people I sleep with and found out that you are not like them." I asked her not to betray me, otherwise I would have to disappear immediately. She said I need not be ashamed, that there really were other girls like me. She asked me not to tell that she had touched me. However, that morning she would not leave me alone. I was supposed to show her. Maybe she could give me some advice. And because I trusted her words, I finally allowed her to examine me. This young woman was the first with whom I entered into a sexual relationship, in which I was the succubus. I had the burning wish to become a mother by her, but she married soon after for money. Nevertheless, she wanted me to move in with her. But I noticed that her husband too was attracted to me, and so I smelled a rat. But I visited her often. One time her husband was home alone. He invited me in to wait until his wife came, gave me a lot to drink, and suddenly he embraced me, wanted to kiss me, and abuse me violently, whereby he found out that I was no young woman. He then threatened to call the police if I did not leave the area. I then decided to go around again as a man, and as such found work in Claparede, St. Denis-on-the-Seine. However, I wore men's attire only during work. At home, I immediately put on women's dresses and kept to myself as much as possible. I did not like to work with men at all. The clothing pleased me even less, and I was still afraid that the husband of my girlfriend would report me. One evening, I bumped into her, and she assured me that I really should go and live with her, that she was finished with her husband, he was too passionate. She thought marriage would be something better. Her husband had made her many nice promises he did not keep, and, she said, I really should become her friend. She would never go with another man ever again. I did not want to, because at the time I, too, had doubts about myself. If at that time I had had the experience and knowledge I now have, I would have taken the place of a wife for her. But at that time I looked at it as wickedness, suffered terribly amid thoughts of suicide, and no longer took any joy in my life as I was leading it. So, in 1882, I left France and went to New York. Here, too, I soon found work as an embroiderer, but was discovered. and then took a position as a maid on a farm in the state of New York because I thought I would be able to live there inconspicuously. At the time, the farmers had a great need for maids, and it did go along well for a while, but one day the farmer's wife was away and he became fresh. I was afraid of discovery, and as I had read that in Jersey City they were looking for embroiderers, I left the place and got a good job in Jersey City. At that time, I bought myself the most modern ladies' apparel so that I looked charming, and spent all my savings because I thought I would be working there for a long time and be earning a lot of money. However, the other young women made my job miserable, so I gave it up. I could still manage well for a few weeks. Meanwhile, I became acquainted with an embroiderer who did not let me out of his sight and followed me everywhere. One night we got drunk, and he found out that I was no young woman. I wanted nothing to do with him, but he did not give in, and I became a victim of his intoxication. He threatened to call the police and tell them that I was playing a masquerade, so I gave him what he wanted. He forced me into sodomy and fellatio and treated me totally as a woman, even bought me pretty toilette articles, so that at that time I became a coquette. A few months passed during which I got more miserable each day and felt more unhappy. One morning, I packed everything together and, when he was away, sold everything of worth, sent my women's clothing off, dressed myself as a man, and traveled to Milwaukee. Here I worked as a man in a timber yard, then as a cook, but because I much preferred to wear women's clothing, I went to Montana in the spring as a woman cook. There, however, betrayed again, I took myself to San Francisco and found myself there in February 1885 and still live there today. Soon after I arrived, the woman I lived and boarded with had a baby girl. Happy hours began for me now because I was able to take care of and clean the little thing. Who was happier than I when the woman said, "Jenny, I like to be called by my feminine name when we were alone. Rich and I want to go out on a trip, look after the child." With what joy and care did I take it out of its little bed, clean it, throw the wet things into the wash, dress it again, cuddle and caress it, and walk back and forth playing with her. I knew exactly how a mother took care of a child and was happy when the woman praised me and said that I had become a good mother. In the 4 years I had the child and devoted all my free time to it, I had sexual intercourse only one time. I did not think about it at all because the child was much too dear to me. Lizzie hung on to me and soon wanted to be taken care of only by me. As soon as she woke up, she called my name. Her father even got mad because she liked me better than him, and she said so. The child grew near to my heart as if she were my own, and never again did I love another child as this one, and that was just as well. When Lizzie left with her parents, I was totally despairing because I loved her so much. I was not as kind to the older boy, even though I certainly did everything for him when his mother was away, but kissed him less. Even today, I often wonder if I should give up my bookstore and rather become a nanny. Bringing up and caring for children is my greatest joy. To raise them in the sense of Froebel, Pestalozzi, and other great pedagogues of children. I read everything I can get on the education of children and know for certain that if I had been able to devote all my time to raising children, my sexual desires would have been totally extinguished. To be sure, I did notice that strange children were not as delightful as those at home. Meanwhile, in San Francisco, I began as an itinerant bookseller. I sought out the dance halls and sold trashy literature. I also had socialist writings and even took part in the workers' movement because I moved about as a man outside of the apartment. Through the dancers, I later even got day jobs, such as cleaning their rooms, sometimes cooking for them, and became good friends with them. They often gave me clothes they no longer wore, so that many visitors even thought that I was a prostitute. At the time, I also drank a lot. It was all the same to me. I got used to all the bad things in society, which, to be sure, I avoided when I was sober. But I had to make a living, and at the time it seemed the best thing to do. The dancers, many of whom were educated, had seen better times at home, and accepted me just as nature made me. Finally, with the help of some of these young women, I set up a house and became their room mother, cooked when they invited their friends over, and besides that, I also had my job selling books. Only as such did I have to play the man. At the time, I easily could have become the lover of one of these young women, but I had no desire and preferred to work rather than be taken care of by them. Well, as soon as I saved some money, I bought a small piece of property, had a house built, and totally gave up the work with the dancers. At this time, I fell very much in love with a young woman of a manly type. However, she did not understand me, and I could not fully accept her. In short, she married another and is supposed to have never become happy. In the 1890s, I began traveling for German newspapers, traveled through California, Oregon, and Washington, then back and forth again, and I still carried on the business of bookselling and of the bookstore. I hoped I would forget my feminine nature by traveling, but in vain. It came before everything. Actually, I felt happy only in my dreams. I dreamed I was a young woman, and a young man whom I loved was waiting for me. I thought, if he really did lie down beside me, as a young woman I would behave by hesitating, but I would only be pretending to resist. And then I would dream I was pregnant and was not ashamed to be a mother out of wedlock. The only thought I had was whether the father would help me raise the child. I went into labor, and hardly was the child born and cleaned that I was kissing it and letting my lover know about the birth, and when he came to the bedside, the child held out its arms toward him, whereupon he kissed me and said, weeping for joy, asked me if we could not both raise the child. I put the child to my breast and played with it. When I would wake up, I would look for the child next to me, because the feeling of being a mother was still with me. Then I would realize, to my dismay, that it was only a dream, and by feeling my body I would notice that I had had a nocturnal emission. But I felt very satisfied, and sometimes I did not have intercourse for years, because this and similar dreams, which I had often since about 1881, made me happy and satisfied. Today, I still dream I am an older woman who has 10 or more children around her. Sometimes they are also grandchildren, and we speak about needlework, new fashions, veils, raising children, and much more, so that I am occupied in my dream totally as a woman. In 1904, I put a few inserts into a marriage magazine that an effeminate man was looking for a manly woman. I could cook, sew, wash, iron, etc. I got many answers, but most of them were studied women who would do it only for money. In March 1906, a distant relative came to visit me from Dakota. She seduced me, but it was not successful, and she irritated me by saying I was no good. She was very feminine. But in June of the same year, an American woman who lived in my neighborhood, who had a strong manly character and was well educated, became friends with me. We spoke a lot with each other. I loved her very much and would have liked to have become her wife, but she did not propose to me, and I was not ready to make her any offer. I expected the woman to make the first move and to be charmed by her, but it had to be an energetic, strong woman who would impress me mentally and physically. I even liked them to have a very small mustache. I would also allow them to wear men's apparel. I alone want to play the female's role, which they have to protect, as it were, as a man. As far as my wardrobe goes, I am exactly like a woman. What the others wear, I too must wear, except that the women's clothing must not have any manly cut or look anything like a man's suit. My taste is totally feminine. I myself believe that I can be of more service as a woman than otherwise. My earliest tendency was to raise children, and as long as I was with them, I never had thoughts of sex. So, how can people say that that is nothing but a passing fancy, when a person really has the tendency all the time, no matter how people, with the best intentions, try to suppress it? I am now 47 years old, born in Austria, worked in Switzerland and in France, in America for 25 years, in California since 1885, traveled for a large German newspaper in Milwaukee, and always a welcome guest everywhere, and can again enter into every house where I once was, have never been arrested, and today it is still my deepest wish to wear a new princess dress, a new flowered hat, and lace petticoats. I also like needlework, have no time for it any longer, and if I were to find an energetic man-woman as a wife, then for her sake I would do all the work that in today's order of things the wife does without hesitating. To the contrary, I would enjoy the greatest pleasure living as a wife, if only I did not have to wear hateful men's clothing any longer. Today, I have now been wearing women's garments on my property for years. I'm writing this too, with a little white cap and white skirt on, decorate my bedroom in the manner of women, and a man seldom enters my room because I am not a friend to men. Conversations with women satisfy me more, and I am always envious of educated women because I always look up to them. For that reason, I have always been an activist for equal rights, and I believe that if ever there is total freedom everywhere, many women would be better fighters than effeminate men who would do their duty in other ways. If effeminate men would show themselves more often, it would be to their advantage. Really, why should we be ashamed of ourselves? I cannot understand why science has had little to do with effeminate men when it really is something you see every day and is natural. And unfortunately, we are often falsely considered to be homosexuals.